to commit to just reading the Bible. That's why I really believe this is such a transformative study, because you're really doing a Bible binge. And when you do this, it's going to impact your life in the next 84 days. You're going to see some changes. And that's why I believe it's so important to journal them, write them down, so you remember what God is doing and what he's speaking to you during this season. So let's go back to my slides here. All right, should have the slides pulled up. Okay, so I wanted to go back to Genesis chapter 1 through 11. Where were we? Okay, so Genesis chapter 4 and 5 is Cain and Abel. And so a lot of you probably are familiar with Cain and Abel. If you're not, don't worry, you're going to read about it. But we see, the fall in Genesis chapter 3, and then Cain and Abel in chapter 4, Genesis chapter 5. We get to our very first genealogy book or chapter in Genesis chapter 5. So important. In fact, I've got a chart I'm going to show you here in just a moment to kind of show you how important those genealogies are. And then in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, we have Noah. And so Noah finds favor with God. He lives in a very, very wicked generation, but yet he obeys God. He's righteous. He builds an ark. And while he's building the ark, I believe he is facing ridicule, and people around him are mocking him, and he's preaching to them, and God ends up preserving him and his family, and of course all the animals, the land animals, go in there. And then at the very end of that, God gives us the rainbow as a covenant sign, and God's rainbow has 7 colors. Okay, other rainbows you may see around the world today have 6 colors, and there's an interesting study there. Don't have time to go into that now, but that's interesting. But yes, God's color rainbow has 7 colors. So again, we see that number 7 come up, the number of completion, perfection. And that rainbow sign is a promise that God will not flood the earth again like he did in Genesis chapter 6. And then at the end of that, God tells Noah, okay, I want you to multiply, replenish the earth, spread out. Does man do that? No, man does not do that. They gather together. And then Nimrod comes on the scene in Genesis chapter 10 and gives them the idea, let's build this tower to God and up to heaven. And so God's like, okay, you want to do that? I'm going to intervene, and I'm going to confound your languages. And that causes, God's intervention actually causes people to scatter throughout the world. And so that kind of gives you an explanation of how we have our different ethnic groups in the world today. It's from that. And so when we're done with Genesis chapter 11, we actually take a break and we go to the book of Job. And so let's go to my slides again here. All right. So in the book of Job, we have the testing and trials of Job. Just to give you a little breakdown on that, Job was a righteous man. He got up every morning. He made sacrifices to his family. I love this part. Job sacrificed to his family just in case they may have done something against God. It really just shows the heart of a father for his child and children. And then we get a little behind the scenes peek at what's going on in heaven. And you have the sons of God, and it says, and Satan was among them. And they actually have a dialogue Satan does with God. And Satan's like, well, hey, looking at different people, and Job gets brought up, and Satan basically just accuses God. Well, he worships you and he loves you because you bless him so much. If you take all that away, he will curse you. And God says, okay, you can take that away. You can touch him. But he actually places limitations on what Satan can do, which is really, really good, because I believe from what and you'll read it this week. If God did not limit Satan, we see Satan's strategy. He is out there wanting to kill, steal, and destroy. And that's what he does. Boy, I mean, he went to the limitations, right up there. And so horrible things happened to Job. He loses his children, he loses his wealth, he loses his livelihood, all of that. In fact, his body has sores all over them and he's in misery. He has these three friends that are supposed to come and comfort him. They're, spoiler alert, they're not very comforting. And even his wife says, you know what, just come on, be done with it already. Curse God and die, but he doesn't. And the highlight, in my opinion, of Job is in Job chapter 38. God shows up in the whirlwind and just starts asking them questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And all kinds of interesting things that God brings up. And then at the very end, Job, who remains faithful to God, does not curse him, endures the suffering, God blesses him twofold. So it really shows the heart of God, the Father, to his children as well. God is a good, good Father. So that's Job in a nutshell. Spend a couple days reading that. And then we're going to have some key verses from Job. I really had a hard time trying to choose what verses to choose from Job because there's two of them. So I put this one on the screen, but I'm going to share another one with you. So Job says in verse 21 of chapter 1, and it said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And the significance of that verse is Job's response to his suffering. It shows an unwavering faith and acceptance and understanding of God's sovereignty. It teaches us about maintaining trust in God, even when we're going through trials and loss in our lives. And I really want to encourage you, maybe you're watching this and you're in a very tough season and you're in a season where it just feels like everything around you is crumbling. That's where Job can encourage us. I want to encourage you today, just trust, keep trusting, endure. I believe we need endurance in America as Christians. I believe we've got some dark days coming if the Lord tarries, and we could go through suffering. And so Job is such a great example of just understanding that nothing can happen to us outside of God will, and just that this body and all the things that we have, our material possessions, really, they're not ours to begin with. It's all God's, and God just allows us to use them. We're stewards of them. And so when he says, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked I shall return hither. Hey, the Lord gives, the Lord may take away, but in all of that, blessed be the name of the Lord. So blessed be his name. I love that one. And the other one I want to share with you is actually in Job 19. So I'm going to go to Job 19. And in Job 19, we're going to look at verse 25. And it says, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and he shall stand in the latter day upon the earth. And so this declaration of faith points to Job's hope in a living Redeemer. It signifies profound trust in God's ultimate justice and redemption, even in the face of intense suffering. And so moving right along here, we have Abraham. So Job, I believe the events of the book of Job happens between Genesis chapter 11 and 12. And so in Genesis chapter 12, we're introduced to Abram, and he becomes Abraham later on. But in Genesis chapter 12, it's Abram and Sarai, and God commands them to leave where they're living, which is the Ur of the Chaldees, and he needs to leave that land. And God says, hey, I'm going to show you a land that I'm going to give you. You just need to come and trust me. And so Abraham does. He journeys to Canaan. They face famine and they sojourn in Egypt. In Genesis chapter 13 and 14, that's where we actually have a situation with Abraham's nephew Lot that went with him, and Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdmen, they're fighting amongst each other, and so they decide to separate. And Abram lets Lot choose, and Lot goes, well, I'm going to go where the grass is green, and he sees this wonderful plain in Jordan, and so that's where he goes and settles. So God reaffirms the promise to Abraham It doesn't actually work well for Lot, though, because he gets captured by a bunch of kings who are fighting in that area. And then Abram goes and rescues him. In Genesis chapter 15 through 17, and actually in 15 and 17, God reconfirms that covenant with Abram, gives him vision and promises of descendants. There's a symbolic cutting of the covenant. And so then we have in verse 16, Hagar and Ishmael. So what Abram and Sarai, God has promised them descendants, and they're both getting old and they're past the age where they would normally be able to have that. So they get this really bright idea. Well, we're going to help God fulfill his will. We're going to help him. He just needs a little bit of help from us. Listen, God does not need help from us at all. He just needs us to trust and obey. In Genesis chapter 16, when you read that, really read that with that in mind, because as we see, even today, the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac, who is eventually born, are still at odds with each other. And all of that happened because of somebody's disobedience, Abram's disobedience, way back there in Genesis chapter 16. So we have the birth of Ishmael. Genesis chapter 17, we have the covenant of circumcision. I alluded to that a little bit earlier. And this is where God changes Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. We have the promise of Isaac. And in Genesis chapters 18 and 19, we have these three visitors that come and they reaffirm that promise. And they say, hey, next year at this time, you're going to have a son. And Sarah's reaction was she giggled a little bit. And so that's how Isaac got his name. It means laughter. But we have right after that this God tells Abraham what he's going to do. He's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, Lot's in there. And so we have this beautiful picture of Abraham interceding with God. And it starts at 50. And God says, yeah, if there's 50 righteous people, I won't destroy it. And Abraham's like, yeah. And then he's thinking, oh, well, what if there's only 40? And God's like, yeah, I won't destroy it. 30, and they keep going all the way down to 10. And Abraham stops at 10, which shows us, hey, he believed there was at least 10 righteous people there. There wasn't. There wasn't even 10 righteous people. It says Lot was righteous, but that's it. We don't know of anyone else that was there. And so the significance of why I want to bring that up is because Jesus does share in the New Testament that in the last days, it will be like the days of Lot and it'll be like the days of Noah. And we read about both of those situations this week. And so, even though I know you're reading the Old Testament and it may seem like it is just distant and doesn't apply, it is absolutely applicable to where we are right now. And so I want you to, we should be interceding. That we should be the role of Abraham, interceding for people. We should always be talking to God about people that maybe aren't trusting him yet. Okay, God, what about this person? What about this person? And we need to say, lift those names up to God and plead on behalf of them, intercede like Abraham models for us. We have the birth of Isaac in Genesis chapter 21, the fulfillment of that promise. And then, of course, with Isaac coming along, then there's a little bit of issues there with him and Ishmael and with Hagar and Sarah. And then Genesis chapter 22, foundational chapter. That's where God asked Abraham to offer Isaac. Of course, God intervenes at the very last stage. And it was something that really stood out to me last time I read through this was, you would almost think it would be enough for God to ask Abraham to go from Ur into Canaan without knowing that. But it just shows that there's always more. There's always more. We never in this life reach a point where I'm arrived. Okay, I'm arrived. I followed God. I did my duty. It's not like that. It's a relationship. And God is just showing himself and more and more. And Abraham's such an interesting person to look at. And we're going to talk about him when we get to the key people here. But we do have Sarah's death and Isaac's marriage in Genesis 23 through 24. So Sarah dies and is buried in Genesis 23. And then 24, Genesis 24, I really hope you enjoy reading that. I love it. It's always one of my favorite chapters to read, where you have Abraham sending out his servant to find a bride for his son. And the servant represents the Holy Spirit in a practical way for us today. We can take a practical lesson from that is the Holy Spirit out in the world looking for a bride for God's son, which is Jesus. And it's such a wonderful, wonderful chapter full of symbology and types and that type of thing. And of course, we have Rebecca lighting off the camel. So of course, camel would be the biblical cigarette if you're into that. I'm just joking, just joking, just joking. Got to make those jokes. I'm a little quirky. You'll learn that as we go. I'm going to show you a little bit of that. At least I did not sing Beatles in this take. I don't know what take this is. There's a few takes where when I was talking about day 4, I was saying, well, yeah, if I do it, I'm just doing that, so I won't do that. But yeah, you gotta have fun. There's a lot of fun things. You'll find out as we get closer to the New Testament, there is a specific car that's mentioned in the Bible. So we'll learn about that later on. But I want to highlight some key verses here. So let me go back to sharing my screen. And in this section, I want to highlight Genesis chapter 12. Of course, should not come to any surprise that we're talking about this verse. This is a foundational, unconditional covenant. Okay, there is no condition on Abraham's part. It is an unconditional covenant that God gives, which includes land, of course, the land of Canaan. And I'm going to read, I kind of just highlighted 12, but really I want to highlight 1 through 3, Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. So much. I just want to say this. Just stop for a minute and see what God just said there. You realize you and I are blessed by God for the purpose to be a blessing. We are blessed to be a blessing. Again, this stuff that we have, these material possessions, the things of the world that we have, we are meant to be a conduit of God's blessing, and it's not ours. It is God's, and we need to have that perspective. Otherwise, that pride of life can seep in, and we can start claiming ownership over stuff that we don't own. It's all God's, including our vessel. Our body is not our own. It is bought with a price. And so that really just stood out to me. The other thing that stood out to me is in verse 1, where he says, hey, get thee away from thy country, away from thy family, into a land that I will show thee. Well, Abraham's family actually followed him there. So I'm not quite sure if that was Abraham not fully obeying or his family just saying, well, we want to go with you too. Could go either way. But if there was a situation where Abraham encouraged them to come, it wasn't quite 100% obedience. And some of the things that we read about this week maybe wouldn't have occurred had his family not there. So just interesting. A takeaway I get from that is we need to be 100% obedient to God. Just a little, and we'll see this later on in the Bible, just a little bit of disobedience. Maybe we obey in 99.9%, but just that little 1.1% can make a big difference. So I just wanted to share that with you. We'll keep reading here though. All right. So in verse 3, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. And so the significance of this promise to Abraham establishes the Abrahamic covenant, highlighting God's plan to bless all nations through Abraham's descendants. It sets the stage for the unfolding of God's redemptive plan. So that takes us through the life of Abraham in that area. And then we're going to talk about Isaac and Jacob in Genesis chapters 25 through 36. There's a few things that happen. You'll read about some dysfunctional families. So obviously, you have Isaac, and he gives birth to Jacob and Esau. And Isaac loves Esau. Rebekah loves Jacob. And then Jacob is a deceiver. In fact, that's what his name means. And so he multiple times deceives his brother out of things. I can't relate to that at all. I have two sisters, so maybe I can relate with that just a little bit. And I think one of my sisters will be watching this, so I'm really going to be careful on how I say that. But, but Jacob is the deceiver, and so it's so interesting how he ends up deceiving Isaac and getting the blessing that was supposed to go to Esau, went to Jacob. That was his mom's idea, but he did it, and then he ends up leaving out of fear that Esau is going to kill him, and he goes to what will be his father-in-law Laban. And you're going to read about this. I don't want to give it away too much, but the deceiver gets deceived. I just love the humor in the Bible. I think that's so funny. But yeah, and then Jacob, he has a highly dysfunctional family. If it was around today, it probably would be a very popular TV show because people just love to watch family drama, right? So he has Rachel, Leah, and then he marries their handmaids and has children. He has 12 sons. And so we read about all of that. And so this section here, going back to sharing my screen, this section really just talks about Isaac and Jacob's family. There is reconciliation, which is a huge part of that. In fact, there's actually reconciliation in two ways. There's reconciliation between Jacob and Esau, and then there was an issue with Laban, and there's reconciliation with Jacob and Laban as well. So it does have drama, it does have dysfunction, has all of that stuff. I'm not saying you may want to pop some popcorn when you read this area, but hey, you may want to. I know, get your popcorn ready. It's going to be a show. But there's reconciliation, and so that shows that even in the midst of dysfunction, there can be reconciliation, and so I hope that's hopeful for you to hear. And so I really enjoy that part. Let's go back to sharing. And let's see what's coming up next here. Oh, yeah, we've got the story of Joseph. So I really enjoy Genesis chapter 37 all the way through 50. It really, the focus turns to Joseph. So Joseph is a young man. He's favored by his father. So Jacob gives him a coat of many colors. Of course, that makes all of his brothers jealous. And to add to the fact, Joseph has these dreams he can't wait to share with his family. He's like, hey, I had a dream that y'all are going to bow down to me someday. Isn't that great? And his brothers are like, yeah, that's great. Hey, you go over there, Joseph. And his brothers get together and like, okay, we got to kill Joseph. So they plot against him. They betray him. He gets thrown into a pit. They were going to kill him. Another brother intervenes and says, hey, let's not kill him. So then they end up selling him to some traders, and he winds up in Egypt. He goes into Potiphar's house, and he rises to rank in there, and he's in charge of Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife, she's like, ooh, he is fine. So she tempts him and tempts him and tempts him. He resists, and then one day she just grabs him, and he resists and he flees, which really is our response. When temptation comes, really we shouldn't be fighting temptation. We should just flee from it. Because the moment we start trying to entertain stuff and reason stuff, that's a very slippery slope. So he flees, she grabs part of his clothing, and as a result of that, he gets thrown into prison. And these inmates also have dreams. One's a butler, one's a baker. He interprets their dreams. One gets promoted, the other ones get beheaded. And then Pharaoh has a dream, and he can't understand it. And his dream is very significant. And Joseph gets brought up out of prison. God gives the interpretation of that dream, and it ends up saving many, many people. So if we go back to our slides here, in fact, the irony is Jacob sends the boys over to Egypt because there's a famine in the land, and they're there to buy food. And Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize Joseph, but there's a reconciliation there between Joseph and his brothers. And Joseph says this at the very end, but as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. So significance of that verse is profound. Joseph's words to his brothers encapsulate the theme of divine providence. It highlights how God can use even evil actions to bring about his good purposes, demonstrating his sovereignty and redemptive power. Absolutely love that. So let's look at some main people here. I have Adam and Eve. The main thing that I would take away from Adam and Eve is their actions show that choices have far-reaching impacts, affecting not only themselves, but all of humanity. And then, of course, Noah, his unwavering faith in God's instructions despite societal ridicule, teaches us the importance of trusting and obeying God. And his dedication to building the ark over many years demonstrates the value and perseverance of fulfilling God's plan. And then his righteousness sets him apart in a corrupt world, showing that a godly life can make a significant difference. And boy, let me just that encourages me. And really, you come to a place where you realize you and I are on this earth because we are called of God to make a difference. God had a purpose for everything he created, and it just happened in 6 days, but you could really unpack that, and you can just see all the purpose behind everything he created. And you were created on purpose, and you were created for purpose. And that purpose is to give him glory. And that purpose is to be in relationship with him, but also to have that relationship with him manifest itself through all of your relationships in life. And it's not anything that's you have to do. It's the Holy Spirit leads us and guides us, and we get to experience God. He is always seeking us. He never changes. He never moves. It's us that change. It's us that move when we make these decisions to separate ourselves with God through sinful decisions and choosing sin over God or our way over God's way. That causes separation. And so, Noah is just such an example of how to live godly, how to live with integrity in a world that is headed for judgment. And our world, not to give away the end of the book, but at the end of the book, there's a big book that gets talked about a lot called Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, God judges the world. And I believe we are in the last days. And I believe that is just right around the corner. And so you and I, we get to be on earth at this time. We get to have a relationship with God. And God wants to use you. We get to be used by God to make an eternal difference, to be part of his plan. And that's one thing I don't know if I mentioned in the very beginning. Part of the most exciting thing I have found about the sequential story, you and I are part of it. The story's not done. I mean, it is complete in that sense right here, but we are part of it. And God is using us. So such a exciting example there. Really